Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to 2 Minute Talk Tips. This week's tip: where can they learn more? As speakers, we know, hopefully, a lot about our topic. We have a lot to share, and our audience wants to hear from us. They don't want to hear everything this afternoon, though. That's why it's important for you to put together a resource that your audience members can go to when they do want to learn more about the topic you're talking about. As you plan a session, you probably did a lot of reading and research. As part of your prep work for your presentation, create a list of all of these different sources that you use. And yes, I'm sure your Miss McGurk in grammar school insisted on a bibliography for that research paper, and that's kind of what you're doing here. The reason in this case, though, has nothing to do with plagiarism. It's so that when you have an impact on your audience and they want to know more, you can direct them to that. Add a slide to your deck at some point that shows where folks can go for more information. Now, that slide could just be a list of books, websites, social media feeds, and other resources. If you're doing this or similar presentations a lot, perhaps you have some web space someplace, a blog, a SharePoint site, or some other place where you can include all of these resources at one simple URL. You can even prepare a handout that shows folks where they can go to learn more. When you do this, you are now more than just a presenter. You are also a connector of people and ideas. You are now an expert resource that gives you more credibility with your audience, and it saves time in your presentation because you can refer folks back to those other resources even more easily. In other words, it's a win all around. So as you're preparing your presentation, be sure to answer that question for the audience. Where can we go to learn more? And that's today's 2-minute tip. Stick around. And after the break, we're going to talk about managing audience expectations. Welcome back. Today, I want to talk about managing the expectations for your audience. Now, there are a lot of elements that go into it, and I've touched on some of these before. I'm going to discuss the commitments you make to your audience and outlines, the logistics discussions you have with your audience, and the risks of trying to surprise your audience. And I'll get to all that in a moment. But first, I want to tell you about a bakery. My girlfriend and I went to a newish Asian bakery that opened just south of Seattle. And our experience was, decidedly mixed. Now, it's not my intention to turn this into some whiny Yelp review. The world already has plenty of those, and including all those reviews of premium steakhouses where people complain about the lack of vegetarian options. But that's another rant for another time. So, no whiny Yelp review here, although, maybe it'll be a little whiny. For many weeks, whenever we drove past this bakery, there was a line out the door and around the corner, and today there wasn't. The front door still had a bouncer, though, to control how many folks were inside at any one time, and she was still there, inside the shop, just leaning against the doors. When we got there, a group of 3 to 4 customers were sort of milling about the front doors, trying to take the perfect selfie. We tried to enter the shop and found out we would have to wait a few moments, which was fine. But it was at that point the folks milling about decided that it was super important for us to be in line behind them and yelling at us for cutting the line, which again wasn't so much of a line as much as people trying to pose in the sun for the selfie. Almost immediately, though, the bouncer let us in anyway, so the whole point was kind of moot. When you get in, there are pastries in plastic boxes throughout the first third of the store. You're supposed to grab a tray and some tongs near the front door and go around and pick up your treats before moving to a separate line to pay. And that's fine. We knew about the trays and such since it's similar to other types of bakeries that we've been to. But there wasn't much signage to tell you about that. You're just supposed to basically know that that's how it works. So we navigate that successfully, pay for our snacks, and order a couple of coffees at about 3:14 p.m. We get our number and wait. And my order number, I think, was 397. At the beverage pickup counter, they are jumping all around the numbers from the ticket machine. So I get there and they start calling for order 354, which tells me this is probably going to be a while. Then they're up at like 368, 372, 361, 700, and it's going all over the place back and forth. So there's really no way of telling just how long this is going to take. So, like I said, we started that at about 3:14. At 3:41, I actually ask about our order, and they finish it up a few minutes later. Of course, the barista apologized for the delay and says that, sometimes it can take up to an hour to get beverages done, and she had no idea why the cashier hadn't told me. Here's why this matters. The taste of the food was excellent. The coffee beverages were fantastic. The problem is this place didn't set the right expectations. From the entry door to the logistics of picking your tasty treats, customers were left to sort of figure it out. On top of that, a 30-minute delay to prepare 2 simple coffee beverages is, simply unacceptable, especially in Seattle of all places. Now, had the signage been better, had the cashier told me that the coffee beverages can take 30 to 45 minutes to an hour, I would have been much more accepting of it. Since the bakery did not define the expectations they were willing to commit to through signage and cashier communications, I applied my own, based on other experiences, as every customer in every business does, and as your audience does when you begin a presentation. If there are no expectations set, we're going to make up our own. And then the bakery failed to meet those expectations that I made up for them. And it's too bad because they bake a mean bun. If I expect to wait a half hour, I can be patient. If I don't know to expect that, I'm going to be cranky. So set expectations appropriately so that when they listen to your dantat of a speech, they are measuring you against the expectations you set rather than the ones that they, the audience, make up for themselves. So there are 5 things I want to talk about with today's episode regarding expectations. And they are, first, teach your audience to listen to you. Second, set basic expectations for short and long sessions in terms of logistics. Third, manage the expectations in your content. Fourth, use the bluff technique. And fifth, understand the risks of holding things back for a big reveal. Part of setting expectations is teaching your audience how to listen to you. Your audience wants you to succeed. And they want you to exceed their expectations because most people don't want to listen to someone fail. They really do want you to be successful. Of course, if you don't tell them what to expect in your presentation, they're going to create their own expectations, like when I assumed it would take 3 to 5 minutes to get my coffee. And that means going back to the very basics of crafting a communication. And that's tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. When you do this, you're setting the framework. They know where you're going to go with your presentation. They know what to expect from you. And when you can match that up with telling them how long it's going to take, you've also satisfied a number of their internal logistics concerns. If you don't set the expectations, now the audience members have their own expectations of your presentation, and you've set yourself up for a hard job. You now have to meet and exceed not only your own personal expectations, you have to meet or exceed your audience's expectations, and you don't even know what the audience's expectations are. And that's a losing proposition for everyone involved. So teach them how to listen to your presentation. Make sure they understand where you're going, what you're going to talk about, and how long it's going to take you to get there. So let's start with some of the logistical expectations of a presentation. And this is really important, and it goes beyond just how long your session is going to be. Getting the logistics right is so important because the audience will retain an impression of bad logistics more than anything else. That means you have to do things like present in an appropriate room. Make sure you've chosen the room the right way. It means you have to start on time. It means you have to finish on time. If you promised there would be food, then there very well better be food for that audience. If your event is longer than the 15, 20, 45, 75-minute presentations we're accustomed to, make sure you explain the additional logistics, such as when are the breaks coming so your audience can be aware of that. Make sure to tell them where the restrooms are in the building if they're not familiar with that particular building, and whether or not they're going to need a security escort from one place in the building to another. How are they going to plug in their computers or access the internet? How are they going to get to the Wi-Fi? They're going to want to know this, especially for their breaks. And of course, what material will the audience members be taking home? Because when you can tell them in advance what type of material they'll be taking home with them, that can inform the types of notes that they are going to take during your session. And of course, how are you going to handle Q&A? Are you going to ask them to hold all questions to the end? Are you going to answer them on the fly as you go? Are you going to put up a separate parking lot for questions that are not directly relevant but should be answered? Are you going to set up a separate box where they can anonymously submit questions? The key is to make sure that you explain all of these logistics to your audience so that they know what to expect as you go through your content with them. Of course, you also need to manage the expectations that are a part of your content. When you go ahead and build that presentation out, one of the things I often suggest is that you start with that outline for your presentation and maybe even include that outline as part of your agenda. That outline that you create, that you built your presentation from, you can go ahead and put that on a slide or put a shorter version of that on a slide and use that to set the expectations for the audience, for the details of what you are going to talk about. You're already creating this as part of your prep process. This is one more way that you can go ahead and use that content to give them a better experience. Also, make sure you can articulate a very clear call to action for your audience so they know what you ultimately want them to do with everything that they are about to hear. Give them that context as early as possible. And that brings us to the concept of BLUF. B-L-U-F, just one F. And that stands for bottom line up front. This is one of my favorite techniques for creating content and setting expectations, whether that's going to be in a lengthy email or whether it's going to be part of a presentation. It's actually a concept I picked up from the folks over at the Manager Tools podcast. Manager Tools and Career Tools podcasts are both excellent ones I highly recommend checking out. But bottom line up front is about setting that expectation with your audience. It's telling them very early on in the discussion just what the discussion is all about, just what you're asking them to do. It goes beyond just having a call to action to actually putting the call to action at the earliest reasonable part of the presentation. You are taking your audience on a journey, and generally they do want to go along with you. Of course, they need you to tell them where you are going first. So tell them. They can then listen to your arguments and the points you make to support them with the context of where all of this is going. That makes all of those points a lot more relevant to them. It makes it easier for your audience members to retain them and to understand them and to know what you're talking about. Early on in your presentation, you can say, for example, we need to implement this program to meet our goals. And then as you continue the discussion, everything you say is supporting that earlier statement. If you don't tell them where you're going, but instead opt to build all that groundwork first, well, then your audience lacks context. They won't know to listen for the things they should be listening for. They may start to wonder what the point of all this is. They can become distracted even more easily. They will also make up their own context and draw their own conclusions for the things you're talking about. And like those selfie-taking folks, they will set up their own standards to fill the vacuum that you left for them. Now your audience will control and set the expectations instead of you. And how do you think that's going to work out for you? Now, I know some of you are thinking, but what about the big reveal? What about the famous Apple technique of doing the one more thing at the end of a presentation? What do you do about setting expectations if you want to do a big reveal and give your audience a surprise like Apple does or like other product companies do? Does this mean we can't do it? Well, not really. You see, generally, big product reveals happen at events where the attendees know they are there for a product announcement, and previous announcements have already trained them in what to expect. In other words, we're not hiding the expectations from the audience. The audience knows that this is coming. The audience knows to expect this and knows to expect this big reveal or this new technology or whatever the particular presenter is about to introduce. So it's a very different context from most presentations, and we're still meeting audience expectations when we do that. And generally, unless you're doing a major product announcement like that, it might not be the best choice. That said, if you do want to surprise your audience, make sure to keep your build-up brief and targeted. You need to make sure that the stories you tell are extremely compelling. They have to be compelling enough so that your audience stays focused on you in the moment. You also have to understand your goal. When you're doing a surprise reveal of a new phone or a new computer or a new service or whatever to mainly inform the audience and get them excited, the surprise reveal can work well. When your goal, however, is to request approval of a plan or to get a budget increase for your department or to ask for a new piece of manufacturing equipment, the big reveal will be less effective. When you have to get something from your audience members will want to know what it is you want before they listen to your justifications for that request. So, when it comes to whether or not to do surprise reveals, the answer is, it depends. Actually, that's the answer I give for pretty much any question that comes up in the technology space. It depends. A successful surprise reveal takes practice and confidence. The longer you stretch out the surprise, the longer you don't set specific expectations, the harder it will be to be successful. Of course, that doesn't mean no surprises. In one of my previous lives, I was teaching a bunch of retail managers the basics of PC technology and the history of mobile computing for one of my employer's major retail partners. About 3/4 of the way into each of my 2-hour sessions, I had a big reveal planned. See, this happened in about 2007, 2008, and I partnered with my organization's PR team to get samples of the original computers from the mid-'80s through the mid-'90s that were literal museum pieces. I had these devices set up on a table and covered with a cloth, and when I got to that part of the discussion, I could pull off the cloth and absorb all the oohs and ahs of the crowd. Folks that attended got to see and nerd out over some of the most important mobile computing devices of the era. Now, this worked because the topic itself wasn't a surprise. The audience knew it was going to learn about the history of these devices. They just didn't know they were going to get to see the actual physical hardware in that conference room. We can still surprise our audience with supporting items, statistics, images, and other cool things. And these surprises can help reinforce the point you wish to make and the point you told your audience you were going to make. When Marvel released the Iron Man movie back in 2008, I saw the previews and considered what I knew of the character at the time and concluded, it probably wasn't going to be any good. Generally, even Marvel's superhero movies at that point had been hit or miss, and I just planned to skip it or catch it on DVD later on. Then people began to see the movie, and people whose judgment I trust and respect started to tell me that it was completely amazing and one of the best movies they'd ever seen. I'd heard this so much and from so many people that, I changed my mind and went to go see it. And my reaction? Well, it was a really, really good movie, but I was disappointed. So many people had said so many amazing things about it that they raised my expectations all the way to the sky. The problem was the movie couldn't meet the newer, higher expectations I had of it based on what folks had told me. Now, if I had seen the movie with my original low expectations intact, I'm sure I would have thought it the best movie of the year and been completely blown away. But based on other audience members' feedback, I readjusted my expectations and set them a lot higher. Don't let your audience define all of the expectations for your event. You want to be the one who defines them. So that's it for this week. Meeting and exceeding expectations is a key to success, and there will always be expectations. Make sure you are the one who defines them. Consider the 5 key things we discussed about expectations for public speaking. And that's teach your audience to listen to you. Set basic expectations for short and long sessions in terms of logistics. Manage the expectations that are in your content. Use the bluff technique of putting your bottom line up front. And finally, understand the risks of holding things back for a big reveal. So what are your thoughts about expectations in public speaking? Go ahead and share them in the comments for episode 22 on 2minutetalktips.com. You can also email your feedback to bill@2minutetalktips.com or reach out to me on Twitter where I am @currentlybill. Thanks for listening. Until next week, tell your audience where they can learn more and set the right expectations. I'm Bill Monroe, and don't get best, get better.